My name is Kathy Davidson, and I'm one of the co-directors of the new PhD lab in digital knowledge. Is that what we call it? Yeah. I don't know why that was. How many people here are part of the PhD lab? Okay.
Right.
And others are from. Can you just quickly shout out what department you're from? And oh, excellent.
Awesome.
Great. Great.
Great.
Literature program?
Right.
And I know you're in the lab, but what is your field? Yeah.
Romance studies.
Romance studies?
Great.
History.
History?
I'm also from history, as well, history.
Oh, wow. History still represents, right.
Very nice.
Management?
Literature program.
Literature?
Religion.
Religion. Excellent.
Great.
Great.
Ha, Salome.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome all of you to one of our, I guess our second event now, sponsored by the PhD Lab, and to introduce you to Petra Durkester, who is, as you'll see, one of the most gracious and knowledgeable of scholars, and who, today we have a very, very interesting day where we're putting together things that often don't go together. In one of my tweets, I said today's a day for driverless cars and headless saints, because Petra's partner Sebastian Thrun is here tonight giving a talk for the Provost Lecture on Information Studies, and he is one of the inventors of the driverless car. Petra is going to be talking to us about Oscar Wilde and especially Salome, and that's where the headless saint comes in. But let me give you just a few formal words about Petra. Professor Thurn's, did you say Durkester?
That's good. Great.
Research and teaching interests include the European and transatlantic fin de siècle and modernism, including literature, the visual arts, opera, dance, and film, feminist and queer theory, LGBT, literary cultural studies, and literary theory. Her book, Salomé's Modernity, Oscar Wilde, The Aesthetics of Transgression, was just recently published by the University of Michigan Press. It's right here.
I did bring a copy.
Book. It's such a readable, lovely book, and it's really smart theory, too. It's, I think, just a model.
Thanks.
Petra's other publications are on Oscar Wilde, Arthur Symonds, Stefan Mallarmé, George Bernard Shaw, Richard Strauss, Victoria Cross. I don't know Victoria Cross.
That's what I'm going to change.
Excellent. Fin de siècle realism, feminism, and modern dance. I met Petra and Sebastian last year when I was giving a talk at Google. A mutual friend at Stanford told them about me, and they invited me to dinner. We'd never met before. And that spirit of intellectual graciousness just pervades everything you do. It's really quite remarkable, and I think a model not just for scholarship, but how we can act as a community. One of the things I was especially thrilled at was that was a dinner where we talked 1 minute about artificial intelligence and driverless cars, the next minute about LGBT theory, MOOCs for the humanities, public humanities, specialized humanities. There were no boundaries. And again, that's very much a model we're trying to promote in the PhD lab. Not that everybody's a non-specialist, but in fact that we learn how, from our deep areas of interest and our deep areas of passion, how we learn to talk to one another, and that we learn to see the world as connected rather than severed. And with that strategic reference to severing, as this image indicates, I'm now going to introduce Petra Durkester. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm really, as Kathy said, we only met last year, but I feel like there were so many wonderful, sort of things that we kind of converged on immediately, which was really wonderful. As Kathy told you, my background is in more late than mid 19th century European transatlantic literature and cultural studies, and also in modernism. So I'm a very traditional humanities scholar. You should know that about me, because at the end of the talk, and then also when we talk later in the humanities and MOOCs workshop, you'll see that I'm now venturing into the 21st century. So I was okay with the 19th and the 20th, but now the 21st is part of my life too, so that's really fun. I just want to give you a little overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I want to take you sort of inside the world of what I'm studying for most of the talk, and then at the end, I'm going to sort of switch gears a little bit and go into studying and teaching Oscar Wilde today, because one of the things that motivates me, I think, is apart from being a geek of archives and literature and all that stuff that I just love to do and think about, I also am a teacher, and I really love teaching. And one of the things about teaching Oscar Wilde is that it really helps me connect the history to today, because there are a lot of social justice issues around LGBTQ studies, of course, and without sort of forcing them on people, I love to talk about the history of it and then lead us to the present through that. So with that said, I'm actually going to sit down because I'm very comfortable up here, and I hope you'll be comfortable too. If you could hold your questions till the end, that would be great. Unless you can't hear something or just want clarification, feel free to ask, but it might help me to just sort of be able to go through some of the stuff I want to do first.
There's just one question.
Yes,
first.
go ahead.
Is it okay if we live tweet your talk? Or wait,
yes, it is. Absolutely. Yes, please go ahead. Yeah. I have nothing to hide. Okay. So my talk is called Oscar Wilde's Afterimages, Wilde and the Commodification of Queer Culture. So, and as you can see, there are two things in there, Oscar Wilde and Afterimages. And what really this talk is about both these things, the historical figure of Oscar Wilde, but then also what I call the Afterimages. I'm going to explain that in a few minutes. Let me take you to my first slide and we can get started. Does anybody know what this is? It's Oscar Wilde's grave at Père Lachaise in Paris. And let me show you the next image. We'll come back to this. This is actually what it looks like now. We'll go back to this. So it's maybe a little bit unusual to start a talk like this with a grave. It's not because I'm into headless saints and corpses, but because I want to recall to all of us the materiality of what we're talking about. And I don't just mean literally the body of Oscar Wilde, but I also mean the materiality of what he represents to people. For those of you who are sitting in the back, you might not be able to see this, but Oscar Wilde's grave is not anymore, but was covered with kisses, lipstick kisses, flowers. You can't see the whole grave here, but people would lay flowers at his grave and just be there and sort of in the physical presence of Oscar Wilde, because he means a lot to them in their material lives today. So that's sort of the kind of arc that I want to go into today, this connection between the 19th century, the actual historical person, and then what does he mean to people today. Let me just say very briefly about this. This, to me, is a sacrilege, actually. The grave was cleaned up literally in November 2011. It's now protected with a glass shield so that people cannot get close to it anymore and do what was called a violation to the grave. We can talk later about what that might mean, but to me, it's sort of a cleaning up of history that erases a lot of love and a lot of desire and a lot of meaning that was part of history. So it's actually an act of censorship that I think is pretty significant. So what are we talking about today? I already said that I was going to talk about Oscar Wilde, the historical person, and mostly through his afterimages. So this is a little image I found on the web. Somebody just did this in the style of Warhol. Actually, Warhol never did this himself. But one of the things that I wanted to kind of point your attention to at the beginning is that really the way that we receive Oscar Wilde today is through the images that we've been seeing for the whole of the 20th century and even until today. So there's a little quote here from Pierre Bourdieu, which I find pretty relevant here. The work of art is indeed made not twice, but 100 times by all those who are interested in it, who find a material or symbolic profit in reading it, classifying it, deciphering it, commenting on it, combating it, knowing it, possessing it. So this idea of possessing the work of art, that's not just the artist himself who creates something and then it's out there for consumption, but it's this idea of possessing, like making it your own. That becomes really important when we look at the history of Oscar Wilde. If you indulge me for a few seconds, I'll keep talking while you please stare at this image. This is actually, I'm not sure if it's going to work in this room, but let's all stare. I won't be able to do this because I'm sitting like this, but if you stare at it for about 20 seconds, this actually has a point. After image, I just want to explain briefly what I mean by that. There's a medical definition of this, which is, this is from the American Heritage Stedman's Medical Dictionary. A visual image that persists after the visual stimulus causing it has ceased to act, also called photogene. And the OED, my go-to reference, of course, says about it, a visual sensation which remains after the stimulus that gave rise to it ceases. So let's try a little experiment. If you have something white in front of you, like those lunch bags, stare at it immediately. It might not work in this kind of setting, but if it does work, actually one of the things that you should be seeing is the inverse of this image. You should be seeing a red, you are? Oh, that's great. You should be seeing a red kind of outside, and an after image should appear in green. This is what's called a negative after image. And I'm using this as a metaphor basically for what I'm talking about with the transformations and adaptations that we look at, of Oscar Wilde's work in the 20th century. We only ever see Oscar Wilde and his works through the after images. So the outline of the original image, in this case, this little thing that you looked at, is actually still visible, but it's inverse. So basically this whole mimetic idea of the original and its imitation is kind of turned on its head, and you see something else. You sort of see the original, it's still there, but it's also changed significantly. And so that's one of the things I would like you to keep in mind as we go through this. So we look at Wilde's image, as I said, through more than a century of cultural images and interpretations, not at the original. We read through a textual and cultural palimpsest. The outlines of his persona and his work are in there, but they are just not the same Oscar Wilde. So one of the things that I'm going to contend and argue about, I think, which is pretty obvious from what I've been saying already, is that after images are not really about the original, but they actually tell us more about ourselves and our way of seeing than about the original. So my talk is not really about rescuing Oscar Wilde from the after images or sort of trying to find some sort of original. But I will argue that all the after images are really, we have to take them seriously. They're there, they're true and valid, and they're basically true and valid because they're true and valid for people. And that's one of the reasons we need to study them and teach them. And that's one of the reasons why I teach Oscar Wilde today. So as far as, just catching you up, because I don't think that everybody necessarily knows much about Oscar Wilde, just kind of saying a few things about him very briefly. He was born in Dublin, he moved to Oxford, he was born in 1854, and moved to Oxford to study the classics, especially Greek, in which he excelled and won some prizes. He made his mark as a great talker in London society. One of the things that he's famous for, of course, is sort of the dandy-type pose that he took on. He went on a pretty miserable lecture tour to the US, so I don't think it's going to reach any of the glamour of Kathy's book tour, for example, but it was pretty miserable, actually. I was doing some research on that in the summer, and some of the stuff that came out of Kansas, for example, was like really just miserable. About 30 people listening to him in this like miserable, bad lecture hall. So anyway, that's one of the things that made him famous in America still. He was also lampooned in an opera, Patience, by Gilbert and Sullivan. There were numerous Punch cartoons and even a novel in which he sort of satirically appeared, called The Green Carnation. He also was married and had 2 kids. For those of you who don't know that, we'll be talking a little bit more about that later. And he became a journalist first and the writer second. He also lived in France, which is one of, on and off, and one of the things that I'm going to be talking about later when I talk about my course, which is called Oscar Wilde and the French Decadence. About the contact with France. The thing that he's probably most famous for, in popular culture, and if people know anything about Oscar Wilde, apart from The Picture of Dorian Gray and maybe The Importance of Being Earnest, the 2 most famous of his works, it is that he was convicted for so-called acts of gross indecency in 1895, and that his trials became kind of a watershed for gay and lesbian history. And we can talk more about that later. He was convicted, sent to prison, and convicted to hard labor. And unfortunately, when he came out of prison, he died very quickly because he had gotten an infection in prison. So he actually already died at the age of 46 in 1900 in Paris. So that's my little spiel about his background. So for most of the talk today, I want to talk about the adaptations of Dorian Gray and Salome, and some of them, they're actually too many, way too many to even go through in a talk like this. So what I want to do is actually just give you a few highlights and group them according to types, and then also just highlight a few of them to talk about in a little bit more detail. I try to sort of find some that were the most important ones and the most interesting ones to talk about. So one of the things that's interesting is when you look at the picture of Dorian Gray, which is the only novel that Wilde wrote in 1891. It was first published 1890 in serialized form, and then again as a book in 1891, slightly revised. And then Salome, which was the same year, 1891. Both of these actually present different traditions of adapting Oscar Wilde, and we can talk more about it. I'm going to go through some of these different traditions. The picture of Dorian Gray, I was actually really, in doing research on this, I was really surprised that the earliest film adaptation of it is actually from 1910, only 10 years after Oscar Wilde's death, and it was Danish. Who knew? I mean, that was really new to me. It was like, wow. And then you can see, I listed some of the other ones, 1913, 1915 in the USA. Then in the UK, where he had been convicted, in 1916, that was, that's an interesting thing. I have to look into that a little bit more deeply in the future. And then 1917 in Germany. So you can see that even right after his death, and despite the scandal, not just the novel itself, but the name of Oscar Wilde was important enough to kind of pick this up. And we'll have to talk more about why that may have been the case. One of the things I'm going to argue is that he became sort of a fulcrum point for not just literary history, but also LGBTQ history. And then, people could kind of look at him and see and define themselves against him or with him in certain traditions. Very briefly about Salome. Oh, by the way, Valdemar Psylander is the first Dorian. So he's the Danish, in the Danish film, he plays Dorian. And then, of course, for Salome, the first adaptation is in 1905, and that's an opera by Richard Strauss, Salome. So I'm going to talk about Dorian Gray first. The first type of tradition that we find in terms of adaptations are actually very sort of conventional. This is interesting because, of course, again, keep in mind, Oscar Wilde was condemned and, scandalously convicted. Dorian Gray actually has a lot of queer overtones. It's been seen, of course, as, maybe the queer or text. The queer novel, we'll talk more about that later. But one of the things that's interesting and striking about the earliest adaptations, and these, of course, are later ones, is from 1945, and then the most recent one from 2009, are actually not about queerness at all. At all. They present the novel as a morality tale, as about the fight between good and evil, and also bring out its Gothic qualities. So the one, if any, that I would recommend of these earlier ones is the 1945 one, and some of you may have seen this. It's actually black and white, and then only at the very end, when the picture of Dorian Gray, you see that, and it's very kind of gary and scary. That's the only time we see color in the whole movie. So it's really kind of very interesting, visceral moment there. The most recent one, and you can see this just looking at the film posters, all these are very heterosexualized. It's really about, like there's couples, right? And the most recent one with Colin Firth in there as well as Lord Henry, he's basically, bringing out a lot of the Gothic qualities of these. So I'm going to go through a few of these just briefly like I am now. But what's interesting is that, I just said, with the mainstream adaptations, one of the words that I would use for that is that, the picture of Dorian Gray was commodified as a heterosexual romance and as a Gothic tale. So, but there's also the converse of that, queer modification of it. And I just thought, since this is part of my title, I want to explain a little bit how I use that word, because I don't want to give a wrong impression that I'm using it in a certain way, or I'm actually using it as a pretty neutral term. So I don't want to imply a value judgment in this when I say the commodification of Oscar Wilde or the commodification of Dorian Gray, for example, that it's good or bad. And I would be a very bad Oscar Wilde scholar if I did that, because Oscar Wilde's own relationship to commodity culture, to the consumer culture of his time, was, at best ambiguous. He did it all. He was a dandy, embraced consumer culture. He was very much into commodities. He literally sold himself to the Victorians, to the Victorian marketplace, while all the while protesting that he wasn't doing it. So he tried to sort of keep himself apart from, selling himself as the high culture person, but at the same time he did sell himself. So there's that. But the way I understand commodity, and we can talk more about this later if you're interested, just to kind of give you a few highlights here, I'm not necessarily looking at it through the Marxist tradition, but I'm looking at one of Oscar Wilde's almost contemporaries, Walter Benjamin, who talked about the commodity as a dialectical image. And we can talk more about this. But what I want to highlight is that it's both of these things. It's on the one hand selling yourself, maybe selling your soul to some degree, but also inhabiting something and possessing it, making it your own, which is very important for the queer tradition in general. So to get to this slide here, there's not just mainstream commodification of Oscar Wilde and these texts that we're talking about today, but also queer commodification. So of course, I could not come to Duke and not quote Eve Sedgwick, of course, who has written better than any of us could on Dorian Gray. I just wanted to kind of point to two things that she said about him. Or about the novel. Parts of Dorian Gray were or were used as a handbook of gay style and behavior. So that's actually an interesting thing to think about, that this was used, it's a novel, but it was used as a handbook and kind of, an instruction manual, so to speak, how to be gay. Very interesting. She also said, like Wagnerian opera, Dorian Gray accomplished for its period the performative work of enabling a European community of gay mutual recognition and self-constitution. So there are these two things. One is the individual self-fashioning, that the queer commodification for the self, and then also a socialization that takes place via these literary texts, which I find absolutely fascinating. That literature can have these functions, that it can help you identify yourself as an individual, but also with a group of other people. Moving on. This is maybe even more shocking. If Oscar Wilde looked at his own commodification today, he probably wouldn't be shocked by the fact that he's been commodified in queer culture, but much rather that he's been commodified in action movies and comics. Whoa, here's the aesthete, Dorian Gray, the leisure, the type of secret evil, the lurker in doorways, and all of a sudden he becomes one of the action hero characters in this mainstream movie based on a comic series, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And this is actually really fun. I saw it the other night. It's pretty fluffy, but it's really fun to watch. And so just to give you a little flavor of this, this is from 2003 and was directed by Trevor Martin. One of the things that's interesting about that is that Dorian Gray becomes part of a cast of characters from fantasy novels, from sci-fi, and then there's also a female vampire in there. He has an affair with her. Mina Harker from Dracula. And there's Dr. Jekyll / Mr. Hyde in there as well. And all of these go and basically save the world. And Dorian Gray, of course, turns out to be the main villain in all of this, not to take anything away. There's also, coming out of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, there's this. A Dorian Gray action figure. Who has, I totally have to buy this. I still don't own it. So this is obviously one of the things I have to do. Uses a walking stick as a weapon. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, but you can also buy the portrait as an accompanying little thing for the action figure. So, that's probably the most shocking kind of commodification that has come out of this. The picture of Dorian Gray, this is one of the interesting things when I teach the novel. It has this great reputation as, and definitely is super interesting as one of the queer or texts. But the thing to know about it is that at no point in the whole text is the word gay, queer, of course not, gay, queer, of course not homosexual anyway, because that would be anachronistic. But any of these words are used, nor is there ever homosexual activity depicted directly anywhere. So Alan Sinfield wrote in The Wild Century, this picture of Dorian Gray invokes the queer image, to some readers at least, despite at no point representing it. So what we're actually talking about when we talk about a queer Dorian Gray is an absence rather than a presence. And it's also a pervasiveness. The whole text is pervaded by the queer spirit. And that's, I'm not saying anything new, it's just not my insight. Mainly comes from, of course, Eve Sedgwick's epistemology of the closet. Here's what she said. The novel is a perfect distillation of the open secret, the glass closet, shaped by the conjunction of an extravagance of deniability and an extravagance of flamboyant display. So that's also interesting, this idea of the open secret, the glass closet. And there's much, when I teach this, I place Oscar Wilde in connection with 19th century discourses about sexology and inversion and, all those kinds of things. And then we talk about what that means, the open secret, the glass closet. If there is no way to represent something openly, how are you going to talk about it? And you know, a lot of these writers, Cedric talks about many other ones, Melville and you know, other people too, had to kind of find ways around it, and they did. So now we kind of jump ahead, and I'm almost done with my little survey of Dorian Gray here, but jump ahead to the 1970s, and of course we know from our own sort of recent history that, of course, there's been, you know, many sort of strides have been made in terms of LGBTQ rights and also the representation of homosexualities in the movies. So this is actually a movie I came across. It's called The Secret of Dorian Gray, a modern allegory based on the work of Oscar Wilde, 1970. So 1970, think, you know, this is like Stonewall time, and things are opening up, and things are very different in the movies too. You know, this is actually probably the first movie, the first adaptation that really sort of sexualizes Dorian Gray very openly. You can kind of see this even here from the portrait and from the way that Dorian is portrayed. And it stars Helmut Berger, who is a Visconti star and a gay icon in the film world. So that's kind of an important thing to know here. I could say more about these things. The other thing, I have to admit that I haven't actually seen this movie, and I didn't really want to spend my money buying it after reading about it, but I just wanted to mention it. Sounds like it could be super interesting, but wait. It's a transgendered version of Dorian Gray, and it's basically just transposing the whole plot, and Dorian is played, obviously, as you can see here, by a woman. And you could think about, you know, this as a really interesting way to, you know, at least the idea as a really interesting way to kind of reconfigure desire and identity. But what the film does, apparently, and I admit that I haven't seen it because I didn't want to spend my money on it, is that it basically makes a femme fatale plot out of it. So it's very disappointing in the sense that it just stereotypes, you know, kind of women, and it's completely anti-feminist. The sins of Dorian Gray. And also Sybil Vane in the novel becomes Stuart Vane, who's basically a struggling artist. So instead of kind of having that interesting, you know, the exploitation of Sybil Vane and the art, you know, sort of the whole art plot in there, it just makes it sound as if the woman, Dorian Gray, is kind of exploiting the artist and stealing his way to make great art. So it kind of, you know, it exploits the novel in a different way, and you know, it's definitely something that I'm not super happy about. This is maybe the one, and this is my last slide for Dorian. This is an interesting novel. Does anybody happen to know this novel by any chance? Okay, this is maybe one that you might want to read if you want to read any sort of transformation, any adaptation of Dorian Gray. So as you can see, these are 3 different book covers. Will Self is a gay writer in the UK, and this is pretty recent. It's from 2002. What's interesting about it is that he transposes the whole plot. It's called An Imitation. A whole plot from the 1890s to the 1990s in Britain, and interlaces Princess Diana's story with it, which is interesting. So there's like connections to the AIDS crisis in Britain. And so one of the things that's interesting about it is, for example, that the portrait becomes a Warhol-like installation, sort of pixelation of Dorian, you know, Dorian's image. So that I find that very interesting too. It's not just one portrait, but it's 9 video screens. And then as Dorian changes and his evils increase, he gets more pixelated. So that's an interesting thing to kind of think about. And then it's called, the installation is called Narcissus. This is also kind of an interesting thing. It also introduces, just very briefly, the AIDS crisis, as I said before. And so the way that Dorian's evil is portrayed is that he is actually spreading AIDS on purpose, sadistically, throughout London. So that's another kind of, you know, the novel has actually been, I think it's really smart, but it has also been accused of some homophobic moments, which I don't think are true, but, you know, it's a very ironic, very vicious, very grotesque depiction of the AIDS crisis in Britain, and some of it, you know, people have taken exception to. But it's a very, very interesting work. Let's see, what else do I need to say? That's pretty much all I wanted to say about this one. Okay, let's move on. So I'm going to turn to Salome now, and you have to indulge me a little bit because I did write a book about it, so I know way too much about it. So I'm going to try to sort of restrain myself and not bore you with stuff, but I do want to go into the history a little bit and kind of show you what's exciting about this, and also how it, you know, has, I think, still has some bearings for how we think about queerness today. So just a little thought to begin with. Transgression because I'm going to argue that Salome is a transgressive text in more than ways than one. Transgression comes from Latin transgredi, which means to step across or go over, beyond, a limit, boundary, etc., to violate a law, a command, a moral code, to offend, to sin. So these are all, this is from the OED. So that's kind of interesting to keep in mind. Transgression always encloses the limit, the idea of the limit. And a lot of my thinking about this comes from Foucault and his great essay, A Preface on Transgression. So if any of you are interested more in transgression itself, I'd point you to that. So just to give you a little bit of background, it was originally a biblical story. It appears in 2 Gospels, and then Wilde really changed it. The 19th century, there was a whole tradition of Salomés in the 19th century, which I can't go into right now, but it was there in art. It was everywhere in the fin de siècle. People, especially in France, wrote about it. Mallarmé wrote Hérodiade, Flaubert had a tale, what's his name? Totally blanking on his name. Jules Laforgue, sorry, I hate when that happens. Jules Laforgue also wrote a morality tale, an ironic one. So there's a great tradition also in art in depictions of Salome as a femme fatale. What's new in Wilde, and this is kind of what I want to stress, is that he turns, as it says there, the biblical story of an innocent princess who just does her mother Herodias' bidding into a sexy tale of aesthetic obsession and sexual lust. It centers on Salome's perverse love, this is new, and desire for Yochanan, the prophet, St. John the Baptist, as her ideal of beauty. So it's these 2 things, like eroticism and aesthetics, that are really in there, and kind of new. And then also that, with that, Salome is not just a femme fatale, but Wilde makes her attractive. He makes her into a modern heroine, basically. And, she also has, and this will become important later, she has some feminist overtones because of that, because she goes after what she wants, basically. So, indulge me one moment. I want to play you a little audio clip. Some of you may know that there was a documentary that came out recently by Al Pacino. It's called Wild Salome. I went to the premiere in San Francisco. It was very glamorous. It was at the Castro Theater. I loved it. And so I thought if anybody should give you a synopsis of Salome, it should be Al. So let's listen to that for just a minute. Oops, sorry, maybe I should. Sorry, let me do that again.
The time of Christ, still a virgin, she is tantalizing, seductive, and after being insulted by King Herod, her stepfather, at his birthday party, she goes up on the moonlit terrace. There she hears for the first time the voice of John the Baptist, who is being held prisoner by Herod in an underground cell. Instantly, irrationally, she falls madly in love with him, asking him to kiss her on the mouth. A young Syrian soldier who's in charge of the guard is himself in love with Salome, becomes distraught at what he sees, so distraught that he kills himself. John the Baptist, a living religious icon, in communion with God, has no use for Salome. He rejects her, and in doing this, he puts his own fate in her hands, for she seeks her revenge.
So I now want to give the rest of my talk just like that. he's got oops, sorry. No, you're not going to listen to the rest of my iTunes. I'm sorry. Right. This is bad. I don't even know what that was. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So to get back to a little bit of the history of the play, I'm really just going to skim over it. He wrote his play in French, actually, in the style of symbolism in Paris in 1891. And he got, this is the wonderful Sarah Bernard, to play, at least it was planned, that she would play the title role of Salome. And the rehearsals were already underway in London. This was actually a huge feat to get this big sort of star actress. I mean, think like Meryl Streep, right? The French Meryl Streep. And he was still kind of an up-and-coming playwright. He had, this was like, he had just become famous, so to speak. And so it was a huge, major feat to get Sarah Bernard to come to London from Paris and play in this new play that he wrote. So he was very happy about that. But, and rehearsals were already taking place in the summer of 1892. But what happened was that the play was actually banned before it could ever reach the stage. The censor actually put a stop to the play, and what I'm going to show you is, there was an official reason for why this happened, but as usual, there are differences between the official reason and the real reason. So the official reason had something to do with the obscure law of not representing biblical characters on stage. But as this private letter shows, that's not really what it was about. This is what he wrote to a friend. It is a miracle of impudence. Salomé's love turns to fury because John will not let her kiss him in the mouth. And in the last scene, where she brings in his head, if you please, on a charger, she does kiss his mouth in a paroxysm of sexual despair. The piece is written in French, half biblical, half pornographic, by Oscar Wilde himself. Imagine the average British public's reception of it. So what I'm interested in is that kind of conjunction between the pornographic and the biblical, of course. And then, of course, also the little side, side hit to the French, who, of course, there's this old rivalry between Britain and France. But, so it's that, half biblical, half pornographic, this kind of conjunction of the eroticism of it, the sexual despair, as the letter says. And then also the idea, imagine the average British public's reception of it. The average British public. So it's this idea of like, you cannot put this out there. It's dangerous. This is art that is dangerous. So that's kind of interesting. So that's why you always have to look at the letters and not just official stuff. So just going through a few more things. What made this play so offensive? Just to kind of recap, channeling Al Pacino again, physically desiring a prophet, a religious taboo, a spiritual taboo. I mean, how much more Nietzschean can you get if you desire the prophet physically and don't even listen to what he has to say? Okay. Then, of course, there's the Dance of the Seven Veils, striptease, all that stuff, a gender taboo. And then also, of course, Salome and the Severed Head, the orgasmic ecstasy of the ending, which is completely breaking all necrophilic taboos, and also, the idea of like sort of a quasi-orgasmic moment of a female protagonist on stage. And then also the unsettlingly open cataclysmic ending. Because basically, Salome is killed at the end, but it's basically as a reaction, Herod kind of says, kill that woman, but as a reaction of fear. And he shuts her down, basically. It's kind of like she has to die, so she can't do any more harm. And it's not a satisfying ending in the sense that we feel like, now she got what she deserved, anything like that. Curtain closes immediately. So the audience is sort of sitting there going like, what? And just kind of wondering what the moral of this tale might be. So that's actually, as I argue in my book and elsewhere, it's a very modernist moment, kind of leaving it open, leaving us to kind of figure what this was about. Very briefly, the play was banned in England until 1931, pretty long. Richard Strauss's opera popularized it throughout the world, but in England it could only be published in book form. And Aubrey Beardsley's famous illustrations, of course, I cannot just glance over them here. They became just as famous, I think, as the play itself, and you may recognize some of these. You may want to take a look at the one on the right-hand side, because I'm going to bring that up again later. One of the things I'm going to get up briefly that's easy to miss is this little sort of, imp-like figure there has a giant erection. Okay, just want to say that right there. Huh? Okay, this little figure here is actually Oscar Wilde. It's the Master of Ceremonies, but it has Oscar Wilde's face. So, even in this very early kind of incorporation or sort of illustration of the actual ur text of Salome, in book form, there are some queer elements, and I mention these because they're going to get picked up later by other queer artists. So keep those in mind. Why did people start reading Salome as a mask for Oscar Wilde? I mean, you could kind of ask, like, it's a transgendered idea, right? Why Salome? Why does she equate Wilde? There are a few reasons for this. One of them lies in a lot of the things that Oscar Wilde said about art as a mask. To reveal art and to conceal the artist is art's aim. Art is not to be judged by any external standard of resemblance. She's a veil rather than a mirror. And this is famous. Give a man a mask and he will tell you the truth. Or this one. All art is at once surface and symbol. Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril. Those who read the symbol do so at their peril. So again, this idea of danger, that art is somehow, it says surface and symbol. Art is a veil. Art is not direct. It's a mirror. But then also this idea that if you read into it, if you read it, you're on your own. And it could be dangerous. So that's one of those things. Then, of course, I already mentioned Aubrey Beardsley's little queer moments. Here's another one where you see, this is called The Woman in the Moon. Actually has Oscar Wilde's face in it. So The Woman in the Moon. There's another sort of little transgender moment there. And then people have interpreted the flower that's in the moon as the green carnation. And some of you who do 19th century history might know that the green carnation was sort of a sign for homosexual circles in Paris and London, sort of the queer underground. At least that's what people think. It can't be completely proven, but that's what many scholars say. So that's a possible other clue towards, a queer and transgendered interpretation. Now I'm going to go into the early 20th century queer appropriations of Wilde Salome. I'm actually just going to glance through because I don't have time to go through them, but I want you to at least see these. There is a history of queer adaptation of Oscar Wilde Salome that starts very early on. And it gets more interesting, I think, as we get closer to our time. But here are two of the most famous ones. I'm just going to mention them. Maud Allen was a Canadian-American dancer, and she danced a version, this is called The Vision of Salome from 1908. And it was a solo dance piece. She danced in the style of Isadora Duncan, for example, and other sort of modern, more free-floating style dancers. And what's interesting about this one is that it really was feminist inflected. I mean, the way that Salome was portrayed on stage was decidedly not as a femme fatale. She was in love with John the Baptist, and it was sort of a mourning dance and a love dance. So she's just really interesting to look at from not just a history point of view, but also an early feminist interpretation. Again, 1908, this is 8 years after Oscar Wilde died. It's very early to kind of go out there, do this on stage, scantily clad, like she was, and then associate yourself with that scandalous name of Oscar Wilde and Salome. Here's another one. This is really cool. It's from 1922. It's a film that's easily available now if you want to take a look at this. It's also on the internet. It's called Salome in Historical Fantasy after the play by Oscar Wilde. And it's famous for an all-gay cast, at least that's what the rumor was. And it was also influenced by the Aubrey Beardsley designs. So it's something very interesting to look at. Both Elena Zamova and Maud Allen, I just showed, were bisexual. And so there's also that connection possibly to want to kind of bring a little bit more queer representation to Hollywood and the dance stage. That's all I have time for those wonderful things. I wanted to show you some queer readings of Salome since the 1970s to kind of bring you up to date. And some of these I'm just literally going to go through very quickly. This is Lindsay Kemp's Genderqueer Salome. This was actually interesting. This is 1977. I wasn't around to see it. Or I was around, but I was too small at that point. And this was the first adaptation is also, obviously a performance on stage that used an all-male cast for all the roles. So again, the transgender stuff comes in. Had some camp elements and also was restoring the original, Wilde Salome to the synesthetic idea, of the Gesamtkunstwerk, like this idea of bringing back not just music and actually incense to the stage, which is something that Wilde had wanted to do for his own production, but also, a live snake, a live dove, and there was a lot of sort of intense sort of assault on the senses. There was intense drumming, for example, going on. So it's just a really interesting kind of wild experiment with Wilde Salome. Then there's this one. This is a great movie, actually. Salome's Last Dance by a film director who's been known as a little bit of an enfant terrible, Ken Russell from 1986. And as you can see, this one actually brings Oscar Wilde into the narrative. So there's a green carnation again. And I think they're talking about the pubic hair of virgins at that moment that he's holding this to her nose. There's like some weird, interesting moment going on. But what's also interesting that you can only see this in the tiny little icon here. When Salome dances, they do in the way that they split, the editing splits the scenes such that you think for a minute that, or actually maybe a split second, you think that she's female. And then you see the penis. And then it goes back to female. So it's like oscillation between male and female there as well. So this is it's really hard to see in this little pixel moment, but this is the male version right there. And then it's just a really sort of fun and campy kind of movie. So highly recommended. This I just want to mention very briefly. There's a mainstream version, it's called A Man of No Importance, which uses Oscar Wilde's Salomé as part of a bigger coming out narrative and puts it into Ireland in the 1960s. And then just to mention another one, this is very interesting, an off-Broadway play. So you see like the range of stuff. And it's very mainstream, and there's like these sort of avant-garde theater performances. And then again, this is an off-Broadway play, which mashes Salome with the importance of being earnest. And you can study this because it's been published. I wasn't able to see this, didn't know about it when it came out. And it's called Now She Dances. Dorian Wilson just passed. He was part of the gay leather community in New York. And there's interesting things to say about that as well. You can ask me more about it later if you like. So I have 2 more images for Salome. This is actually something very interesting. I just want to spend a little bit more time on this. Dorian Katz is also a genderqueer artist in San Francisco. She happened to be my student a few years ago. And so she's an artist and took my Salome class, believe it or not, and then started producing some art. She is part of the transgender feminist community in San Francisco. And so she, a lot of her work is about transgressions of both gender and sexuality, and she's also part of the S&M community. So you can see like lots of stuff going on. So what this is actually her illustration of the kiss, and she figures her own face as John the Baptist's, and the face of Salome here is Sarah Bernard. So there's like some lesbian fantasy going on. Dorian kissing Sarah Bernard, right? And she uses her own blood in this painting. So what I find interesting about this is that actually, she really uses, she feels connected to this history of Salome, and literally, with her own blood, feels connected to it in a very visceral way. It speaks to her, and she wants to speak back to it. So I think that's one of the things that I find most fascinating in a lot of these versions is that, when they do speak back, to the history, it gets very interesting. Here's another one that she did. Again, she used her own blood. This is another Salome. This is called The Ecstasy of Saint Salome. And the little writing that you see is actually the love monologue of Salome at the end to the head of St. John the Baptist. She also has just a tiny little detail. Again, remember Dorian is part of the S&M community. High heels, more blood. So, she plays around with this a lot. It's really nice. And again, I'm happy to talk more about it if you like later. So this is the little detail I asked you to pay attention to. This is a detail in the original Aubrey Beardsley drawing, Wilde as the master of ceremonies. And again, Dorian does something very interesting in her drawing, which is to take that, let Oscar Wilde show, I don't think I should do this on camera, but use the middle finger and point it back. And the other thing that you don't see there, I have to describe to you, is that he holds David Wojnarowicz's Postcards from America, X-Rays from Hell from 1989, which is a queer indictment of America during the AIDS crisis. So interesting. So she takes Oscar Wilde, puts him into her drawing, and makes him speak back by giving us the finger, literally, and also kind of pointing towards the AIDS crisis. So again, it's this kind of mashing up of history and the present, and then, of course, queer history, the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, that I just personally find very meaningful. So I'm getting to the last part of my talk where I'm kind of doing a little bit of a jump from here to the teaching part and just kind of want to motivate that a bit. The legacy of Oscar Wilde today. This is just a little fun quote from Alan Sinfield. Wow, what a fabulous camp queen, we would say if he came into the room today. There's just 3 little things that I want to, and each of these kind of stands for a certain thought about what we've been talking about so far. Quotes that I find meaningful. Let's look at that. Judith Butler. In the wake of his 1895 trials, imprisonment, and sexual and cultural shaming, Wilde's name functioned as a kind of prohibition, but also as an enabling occasion. I personally find this very important because it means that it's not just Oscar Wilde the victim, the historical victim, but it's an enabling occasion. And if you look at Dorian Katz's art, for example, you see that it enables new kinds of art, new kinds of ways of representing queerness. Wilde and his writings look queer because our stereotypical notion of male homosexuality derives from Wilde and our ideas about him. So that's also an important thing. As a teacher, I need my students to understand that. We think Wilde is queer because we've been reading him as such, through this whole century. And, the way that queerness functioned in Wilde's own culture was actually very different. It's related, of course, to what became of it, but, it's important to make these distinctions. And then finally, this, let me just go to that in my thing. This little quote from The Picture of Dorian Gray, which emphasizes complexity. Dorian used to wonder at the shallow psychology of those who conceive the ego in man as a thing simple, permanent, reliable, and of one essence. To him, man was a being with myriad lives and myriad sensations, a complex, multiform creature that bore within itself strange legacies of thought and passion. This is like probably my favorite quote from Dorian Gray. This idea of, it's very postmodern in many ways, like the idea of the things, the ego is not a thing simple, and it's not permanent, it's not reliable, it's not of one essence. That goes for, selfhood in general, but especially the way that I think about queerness, that it's not of one essence. And then the idea that, the myriad lives, myriad sensations that bear within, or the self that bears within itself strange legacies of thought and passion. We have strange legacies inside that some of them, we might not even be aware of. So, studying and teaching Oscar Wilde today, making a little bit of a jump here, as I said. There are reasons, I'm not going to go through all of these now because I want us to have time for discussion, but there are reasons why he's very interesting to teach from the literary history and theory point of view, and some of them I've already mentioned. He's a liminal thinker on the cusp, from Victorianism to modernism, so there's all sorts of interesting historical reasons to teach him. His aesthetic philosophy has some affinities with postmodernism, the idea of truths, more than one truth and not the truth with a capital T, non-mimetic wordplay, the way that his style works. Sedgwick got at the idea of preterition and the idea of the sort of avoiding talking about it directly, but talking about it so obviously, in other ways. Also, this idea of the implosion of monolithic morality that I find very interesting. So there's that. There's literary history and theory. Then, of course, there's queer theory and history. That should have been plenty obvious in this talk. Historical developments. Wilde is important to teach because of this context of 19th century sexology. So when I teach him, I'm actually teaching him alongside Havelock Ellis and Carter and some other important sexologists of the time. And then also from a legal standpoint, it's important to understand the history of criminalization of homosexuality, and there's certain trials, and of course, his was probably the most famous one, and then there's the Radcliffe Hall trial in the 20th century, which sort of did for lesbian legal criminalization what the Wilde trial did for male homosexuality in the 19th century. Then, of course, there's the idea of what does that mean? Where is the queer, in texts like these that don't talk about queerness directly? So that's both a literary theory question and a queer theory question. Then also the fact that Wilde just, kind of was made up of quotations of other people. Like, where was the essence in Wilde? Was there a queer self? He was completely mashing up others' writing from different nationalities and different traditions, sometimes even quoting himself, from one work to the next. So where is that, to think about that queer self, where is it located? How is it textual from the beginning in Wilde? And then, of course, also the relationship to other interpretive lenses, like nation, race. Wilde was Irish. That's one of the things that one can easily forget. That kind of influences how one thinks about his queerness sometimes, or it's easily forgotten sometimes too. Religion, texts like Salome kind of ask for that, the idea of morality, ethics, cultural politics. So all these other lenses, how do they go together with queerness? And then also, and this is my last point before I tell you about the course that I'm teaching, pedagogy. Wilde is important to teach because he is a fulcrum point for 19th century literary theory, cultural studies, gender studies, and queer studies. And there's a certain cultural and historical chronology, not chronology, genealogy, which is a word that Nietzsche uses and Foucault also, about aesthetics and ethics and sexuality that has to be taught, has to be thought through, has to be seen as historical. There's a development there that needs to be understood. And then also the idea, like, how can I help students understand the way that we've been receiving Wilde and sort of conceiving of Wilde through all these, what I've called afterimages in the talk. What's the difference between the original? Do we even know and care to discover the original? I probably would say no. There are many, many versions of Wilde, and it's important to understand that today and tease them out and understand what their implications are. And then through all of that, also, I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I personally am motivated by social justice issues and critical thinking about ourselves, like looking at these afterimages afterimages. What is it that we can learn about ourselves? Ourselves as readers, ourselves as onlookers, ourselves as agents and participants in this kind of tradition. What can we learn about ourselves and our own socialization, our culture, by looking into these mirrors and these afterimages? So this is what I'm doing right now. I actually am teaching a class called Oscar Wilde and the French Decadence, and I have to say that this is a very, it's not a queer theory class. I will actually be teaching queer theory class next quarter, so that's where I'm going ultimately next quarter. But this is a very historical class about Oscar Wilde and the French Decadence, and it's also my first, venture with anything MOOC-like. And I also have to say immediately that it's not an actual MOOC because it's not massive by any means. It's just open and it's online and it's a course. But so I call it a minuscule or a minimalist MOOC because what I want to do in it is actually experiment with close reading. And as I've been stressing in this talk, the idea of reading after images and like teasing them out and also understanding the history of things revolves around a practice of reading and a very ethical kind of reflection of how we do that. So what I wanted to do with this course, and again, it's very traditional, it's a comparative literature and French seminar, it's cross-listed with French. I have 21 students in it right now, and which is very good for comparative literature at Stanford. I usually get like 5 or 7, that's pretty normal. So this, there's been a lot of interest. But it's open to anyone. So, all the readings, my schedules, my syllabus is online. The exercise is online. I've been actively inviting people to participate. So I've actually kind of I sent out notices to Victoria, which is the big sort of 19th century studies listserv. I've advertised it on Twitter. We have a Facebook page. That it's the beginning. But by the way, it's only the second week too. So there will be more of this. But it's a traditional humanities seminar, and this is important to me because I want to figure out, as a traditional humanities teacher, how can I do this without a huge tech support team, without really knowing much. I'm not a tech person myself. I had to learn how to use WordPress for this. Okay. I now do. I'm kind of proud of myself for that, I have to say. This is wonderful because it challenges me in ways that I didn't anticipate too. So by making it open, we're going to be talking more about sort of doing exercises, and I want to show you 2 examples here. You see here on the website, this is just a screenshot, so it's not live right now. But one of the most recent ones that I did is image and sound interpretation of Wilde's The Harlot's House. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then also there was a brainstorming exercise at the beginning of class. And all of this is being put online, and students are participating online. So we have had comments from outside as well, but maybe that's one of the things that I kind of want to talk about in the workshop later, how to increase, if you're not doing an actual course that people can take for credit, how to encourage people to actually do it with you. What's the motivation? Because apparently it's not just to read things, that apparently is not enough motivation. Anyway, I just want to talk very briefly about these things. What I think is really kind of unique with this medium, and what I really love about doing this, is that it's this sort of wild and free space all of a sudden that I was thinking, okay, so close reading. Why not do an exercise in which we explore, in this case, Wilde's The Harlot's House, non-verbally? Because we can do that online. So it's an image and sound interpretation, and I'll read it to you, actually. Let me go to the actual, I'm not sure if I'm online now, we can do that later, but I'll tell you. The exercise for it read something along the lines of, think of what's really important to you, what stands out in this poem, and think of an image or a sound or a series of images. So it could be like sound of footsteps, it could be a song, it could be somebody else reading. In this case, this is what one of the students put up, a poem by Emily Dickinson that seems to speak to this, or an image, as I said, a photograph, just something that is non-verbal, and put that in there. And then I kind of made it I made it voluntary to tell the class why people chose that. Some people just kind of put stuff on there, and really some really interesting stuff come out of it. So just kind of to recap and to bring it back to Oscar Wilde, and this whole idea of exploring an old topic, a historical literary topic, with very new means that wouldn't be possible in a regular classroom. Then also, I happen to know, as most of us, who are teachers know, that it's a really good thing to recap at the beginning of the course what students already know about something, and to connect what we're doing to what they already know. So the brainstorming exercise that you see there was just literally, it was in the classroom, was like 1 minute. Everybody took out, a pen, and then we recapped it online later. I asked people to put their responses online. It was like, what do you understand decadence to be? Like, what comes up in your mind when you think of Oscar Wilde? Because usually that brings up stuff that people have, have in their minds as a preconception that they bring with themselves. So it's just things like these. And the course has only, been live for 2 weeks. People from about 12 or 13 countries have already found us, which is kind of exciting. And I'm starting to get some emails from other teachers who look at it. So that's actually a wonderful thing. I'm very happy to kind of develop this community of teachers to think about how to teach Oscar Wilde. And, maybe the French decadence. Haven't heard from France yet, but we'll see. But, this whole idea of like crowdsourcing interpretation, readings that also, translations, like especially since I'm a comparative literature teacher, it's really interesting to kind of think about this idea of doing different translations side by side, or doing the original, having it read by somebody who actually is a native speaker. We do that in my class, in the live class, by a native French speaker reading the Baudelaire, and then somebody else reads the English translation, and you really kind of get a different visceral sense of what that poetry is like, what it sounds like. It's not just words on a page. So I'm trying to sort of explore different kinds of things with this type of course. And I'm happy to talk more about this. So I think, as a teacher, just to kind of wrap this up, what's important to me, apart from the fact that I'm an Oscar Wilde geek, as you probably noticed by now, is that students learn about the formative power of these images that we have. I mean, this course is not representative of that because it's really a straight literature course. But in my queer theory class that I'm going to be teaching next quarter, it's going to be not just the original Oscar Wilde text, but it's also some of the after images of Oscar Wilde. So to start them thinking about the formative power of these queer after images, these fantasies, these fears in our culture, and then also what does it say, what it says about ourselves. The idea of binaries, transgression versus normativity, or, what does it mean to say, a text is commodified versus a text is not for sale. These fantasies and fears that we attach to those. And then also, finally, I really, I'm looking for new ways to make students appreciate not just Oscar Wilde, but also sort of this amazing history of queer representation. And so I'm hoping that, some of this will help me do that. Thank you guys very much.
French in London?
You mean when Sarah Bernard?
Yeah.
Yes, it was supposed to be in French. Okay. And one of the things about that was this is where the lens of Wilde's nationality comes in that we actually kind of have to think about, because he wrote the play in French because he wanted to be part of the French elite, basically, and kind of like wanted to show them, I can do this too, and I can even do it in your language. And then having Sarah Bernard there, who was like the big star power person, it was supposed to be his entry ticket into Paris society, but he kind of got there differently anyway. But it's interesting because that's part of his way of selling himself, not just to his own public, but also to the French, actually. Sure, you're welcome. Other questions, reactions? Yes, Kathy.
Tell us about the actual mechanics of how your class works. I love the
yes,
idea of a
yes, and
traditional humanities class that's open, because my guess is many people in the room actually come from a traditional humanities background, but might be interested in like what it looks like to do a class on it.
Yes, I'm just seeing. It looks like I'm online.
More in the 1:30 workshop too, but
yes. Let me see if so our website is wilddecadence.wordpress.com.
Sometimes people think if you're going to.
Oh no! I have to be. I don't want to be registered by you. We'll have to figure this out for the workshop. But I can tell you about it. So this is one of the hard things to figure out because, as I said, I'm only one person. I don't have a tech team, so I don't have quizzes or online essays that people can submit. I literally use, the other challenge is I wanted to keep it simple so that I can actually do it. Oh, good. So maybe we can plug this in here. So the way it works, I wanted to keep it as simple as possible because this is an experiment. I basically want to show to myself and the world that traditional humanities teachers can do this now. Without, having to learn. Yes, I'm married to a computer scientist, but I swear he's not involved. And it's one of my, I wanted to do this on my own kind of moments. So it's a WordPress document, and we have blog posts. I have some exercises in there. Let's see if
I hate
I know.
Apple. I'm sorry.
You do? Oh,
Well,
really?
it just makes me so mad that everything has a different dongle.
Right, yeah, that's
has a different
true.
adapter. It's ridiculous.
That's true. Let me see if this works. Anything coming up? Well, why is nothing coming up? Do we still have the tech person around? Oh, we can maybe do this for the workshop afterwards. Yeah, I'll just talk about it now. So anyway, we have it's basically just like blog posts, and the exercises are online as well. So I'm asking the students themselves. We all share the password. I gave it to them. And so they can actually get into the blog and be editors as well. So it's not just me, like we're all doing this together. And so they are doing their work in the blog posts, in the actual, field where you put the blog post in. And then the public is invited to participate. You're all invited to participate in the comment section, and also, of course, via email. We're also going to do some other things like a Twitter hashtag discussion, which is scheduled for next week. And then I was telling some people at breakfast that, this is a challenge for me too, because I'm literally announcing that I will do things I don't know yet how to do. Like virtual office hour. I have no idea. I have to figure it out. It's coming up in 3 weeks from now. I'll figure it out until then. So, Google Hangouts doesn't work because it's only for 10 people, so I have to find other ways of doing it. But I'll get there. And so there's participation from the public, but it's not in this kind of we're all doing this as a course and we're all doing the same essays at the same time. Honestly, right now, I'm not interested in that because I just want to figure out the close reading part. And the crowdsourcing, as I said, crowdsourcing interpretation, looking at different ways of thinking about literature. Because one of the things I'm also doing right now is I'm taking a MOOC through Coursera it's called the Modern Poetry out of UPenn. And it's a humanities MOOC, and it's been going on for 3 weeks at this point. And so I'm taking it as a student so I can experience what it's like. And one of the things I've learned already is that, the quiz and the essay format that they're doing online with thousands of people, it just doesn't work for me. I don't think it works the way it's supposed to work for humanities. So it's just very clunky. And we haven't even, we talked about this at dinner, we haven't even scratched the surface of what's possible to think about, really think about what the medium can do for the humanities. So I'm kind of sidestepping for now this question of assessment and, the essays, the quizzes, all that stuff, because there is a lot to figure out. I'm certainly not going to figure this out by myself right now, but there is stuff I can do online right now that is just exciting. And my students have been, honestly, I think that just putting their work out in public has upped the stakes for them, so they're really engaged and really sort of proud of their work, and it's out there. And I showed them that we're all kind of addicted to the blog statistics at this point, because you can see how many people and from what country, and how many clicks the different posts got, and they were like, wow, people from Spain are watching us, and so it kind of gives us, it gives them a little bit more of a stake than if it was just a 5-person, Stanford humanities seminar. That was a very long question, too. A very long answer. Yes, what's your name? Sorry.
I'm Sam.
Hi, Sam. Yeah.
So this question moves back to the other half of your talk, but maybe also touches on the pedagogy side. Being a religious studies person, I was really interested in the Afterimages concept, and I think it's a really cool one. And I started thinking about how it's different than the idea of hagiography. Writing about saints. So I was wondering if you could touch on that a little bit, but at the same time, there was insistence on your talk, or a separation between understanding the historical development of these things and then also understanding ourselves. I know in the religious studies field, to think about hagiography becomes very challenging to some people because the goal of the scholar sometimes, not always maybe, to show how the image is created, whereas the goal of the follower of a saint is to say, no, that's my saint.
Right,
we're not,
right. So you mean the personal connection to the saint?
Personal connection, and how even the very suggestion that hagiography is an after image or
oh, I see.
a new interpretation can be very viscerally damaging to some people.
Yes. You were asking about hagiography and the idea of after images, and then this idea that, you know, for some people it's really difficult to think of them as after images because there's such a visceral, like, sort of personal connection that there is no separation to some degree, if I understand you correctly. So one of the things that's interesting, and, you know, I didn't want to go too much into the theory behind what I'm thinking about with the after images, but let me just mention this. I mentioned Walter Benjamin, who was, wrote wonderful stuff around in the 1930s. And there's this separation between what he calls exhibition value and cult value. And this comes out of the Marxist tradition, but never mind, you know, forget about that. What I find interesting with that is that he basically says that there are, you know, what I call after images. These things are things that we display, and they're sort of cheapened in a way and flattened because they're not the original. So that's kind of his argument. The original has what he calls an aura. And then, you know, this is in this essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproducibility. And he makes this distinction between cult value, so original, like religious cult value, like this visceral connection to something, and exhibition value. So, for example, if you think of a painting, the original, this is not the religious stuff, the original painting to him has more aura than its reproduction, okay, like a postcard of it, okay, that's his big argument. But the thing is, and then he says, so cult value is different because there are so objects from cult and religious contexts that literally have a transformative meaning. If you think of, you know, the hagiography tradition, or if you think of, you know, I'm Catholic, I have this whole Catholic background, in some of that ritual, things are supposed to, you know, like the host is supposed to be inhabited by the representative of God, you know, so like there's, you know, that there's no separation between the original and the representation. So what's interesting in some of these images, and maybe also what you're talking about, is that the exhibition value and the cult value get together much closer. So remember when I showed you that grave of Oscar Wilde? It really means something to people. It's not just, you know, representation. This is like, it's me, you know, that's why people kiss it. And I'm sure there's other reasons why people kiss it, but, you know, for a lot of people, they make literally pilgrimages there. So it's interesting. So when we talk about these after images now, you're right, I kind of made that distinction, but I kind of want to bring them together again and say, well, this is why it's so important to continue this sort of queer tradition of making art and representation around these images, because it means something, you know, like we can't just dismiss it. And it's, you know, this is the way that people identify themselves with or against a certain identity. So I really appreciate that comment and this idea of the hagiography. That's, you know, there's that very sort of thin line between, you know, that representation and that it's so visceral that it becomes a part of yourself. Like it's this idea of possessing it, you know, like inhabiting it almost.